Okay, we ready? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. We've convened this forum tonight because, as some of you may know, this is Domestic Violence Prevention Month. And I think on the heels of all the activities and incidents that have occurred recently, it's very important to talk about this, bring it out of the shadows, which it finds itself in many times, and to underscore what I believe is lost in many of these discussions, and that is, we believe the survivors. Because all the studies that have been done show that the number of complaints that are false is anywhere from 2% to 8%. That means 92 to 98% are telling the truth. So before we begin, we want to say thank you once again to the city of San Mateo. They graciously opened their chambers this evening for our event, particularly to the city clerk, Patrice Olds, and to her team and Chris Perez for their help. So tonight we want to talk about domestic violence because it remains such a taboo subject, and in part because there's so much mischaracterizations and myths. We're here to tell those of you who are survivors or those of you who are concerned about domestic violence that we're here because we believe you. We're here to tell you that you are not alone. We're here to tell you that it doesn't matter why you stayed, and we're here to tell you that we have your backs, and we are not going back. So Why I Stayed campaign took off more recently after the Me Too campaign, and I just want to read briefly some of the comments. Bev, who created the Why I Stayed, said, "I stayed because my pastor told me that God hates divorce. It didn't cross my mind that God might hate abuse too." Rachel said, "I was determined to make it work, wanted the kids to have their dad, convinced myself that what he did to me wasn't affecting them." Kat said, "Because he made it seem like I had no one else but him, that if I left, I would have no one." Maven said, "Because I knew no one else would want me. I was lucky that he chose me. I finally left because he almost killed me." An anonymous commentator said, "Though I was the sole wage earner for most of my marriage, everything was in his name. I had no credit rating. Nobody'd rent to me." So that is what we bring to the table tonight. Domestic violence can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be financial abuse, or it could be all three. Every year, more than 10 million women and men are subject to domestic violence. That's 20 people per minute. And when there's the presence of a gun in a domestic violence setting, there's an increased risk of homicide by some 500%. So, the evolution of Why I Didn't Report came on the heels of the testimony that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford provided to the Senate Judiciary Committee. I sat in that committee hearing that morning to have her back. And after she completed her testimony, it was so compelling that even the President of the United States said it was. And yet, when all was said and done, they decided they didn't believe her. So it's really important that we not shove this aside, that we indeed bring it out in the open, that we talk openly about it, that we continue this dialogue. And tonight we have a superb panel that is going to help us see where we can go with this issue here in San Mateo County and across the country. I might add that the Victims Against Violence Act was passed back in 1994, I believe. It was totally bipartisan. And now it's limping forward with just 3-month extensions because it's become so partisan. Domestic violence knows no party affiliation. It knows no economic status. It knows no gender. So tonight, hopefully, we're going to provide some insights into all of this. We're now privileged to hear from 2 firsthand accounts of domestic abuse. First, we'll hear from Rosa Brenes. As you will hear, she has healed from the trauma and turned her life around. 2 years ago, she started working for the Daly City Police Department, in large part because of her experience. Rosa, thank you for your courage to share your personal story, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I was...
Push the white button.
Oh, there we go.
I think every time you turn it on one more time. There you go.
There we go. So I was 20 years old when I first became a victim of domestic violence. I had a little baby. She was about 9 months old. And it was hard. It was something, you know, I wanted my daughter to grow up with both her parents and have a family, and it became extremely difficult to leave, but as time went on, the violence just became worse. I would constantly fall for I'm sorry, it's never gonna happen again. I didn't mean to hurt you, I love you, I want my family. But as time went on, like I said, the violence got worse and it became even harder to break away. He had the mentality that if he couldn't be with me, then no one could. There were times where he would threaten to kill me. He would call my parents and tell them that he was going to kill me and to take a good look at my face before I left the house, because that's not how I was going to look when he was done with me. My daughter was about 3 years old when I finally left. It was, you know, you think, well, my child is small, you know, it's not affecting them. And he would tell me, oh, she's little, she doesn't understand what's going on. But she understood everything. She was terrified every time I would drop her off, because, you know, she was scared that I wouldn't be back to pick her up. She would go to supervised visits with her dad after I had filed for custody, and supervised visits for him. And every time she would get into a visit, she would walk over to a wall, put her hands up on the side of her head, and scream and cry that she wanted me, she didn't want to be with her dad. And I would sit there and wait in the waiting room and hear her crying, but I couldn't go in because there was a restraining order, and we couldn't be in the same room together. And it was the most, it broke my heart to hear that, to hear my daughter hurt so much. And I still live with that, where I feel, you know, it's my fault. You know, I should have gotten out sooner. But I think that, you know, it's definitely made our relationship stronger, mine and my daughter's. She doesn't see her dad. She hasn't seen her dad since she was probably about 4 years old. She sometimes asks for him, but she doesn't refer to him as dad. She calls him by his first name. And, you know, she is an amazing little girl, and she's definitely my motivation for leaving, for getting up, and for fighting to get through everything. So definitely my experiences is what has led me into a career in law enforcement. I think that, it's definitely, it keeps me humble. I can empathize with victims in similar situations. I understand the resources, and there's so many resources, and I've had an amazing advocate with the district attorney's office that helped me through every step of the way. And there's so many resources for victims to utilize to help them in their process and to break free. And I know that I can't save everybody, but I try, and it's that helps me, and it helps in my healing. It's been a long time since everything has happened, and I've been able to close the chapter, and I realize that that was such a tough time, and I feel like I can get through anything. And it's just a story at this point in my life. It's just a story. It doesn't define who I am or anything. It's a story of my past life, and I've moved on, and I'm happy where I am today.
Thank you very much. So our next survivor is Jessica Hudson. She has incredible courage, and she has 2 children and has been rebuilding her life and those of her children. And you're now going to see the remarkable resilience of this woman. Jessica?
Thank you. Do I need to, if I can figure that out. Hi. So I was a single mom. I had a 2-year-old when I met my now soon-to-be ex-husband, and I just really wanted her to have a dad. She was never going to have her bio dad, but to have one. And he swept us off our feet, and he said, why don't you quit your job and stay home with your daughter, and I'll take care of things. And I thought, oh my gosh, how lucky am I? But then I couldn't leave the house, or everything we owned was only in his name, or I shouldn't talk to my family or my friends anymore because they're just making our relationship more difficult, or they're bad for me. And I came from an abusive family of origin, so I thought, I'll never marry someone like my dad. I would see that coming from a mile away. I did not. And he mostly was very controlling, and his silence was the scariest thing. And my kids have said the same thing. We're afraid of Dad when he's quiet because we don't know what's going to come next. And on St. Patrick's Day of 2012, I married to him. At this point, we have a second child. He violently rapes me on the floor of our living room right next to our kid's bedroom, and he's holding me down and hitting me across the face while I'm sobbing. And I still stayed because he said, well, your dad abused you, so you just like being a victim, and you're just really like understanding what happened wrong, and also you're crazy. And then, because I have post-traumatic stress disorder, I was a little crazy. I started staying in my closet and crying or feeling suicidal and not understanding what was causing this. I really didn't connect it because my ex-husband said that he didn't do that, and I remembered it wrong. And so we moved up here shortly after that happened from Southern California. I knew nobody, but I got into therapy because one thing he honestly still says is that if I change, his behavior will change. So I went to therapy every week, and I have for the 6 years I've lived here, and I realized that I had changed and his behavior had not changed. And I remember the moment so clearly. He came over to argue with me about car insurance, I think, and I had done the work in therapy, and I was communicating the way they say to, and I did everything right, and he still lost it and screamed at me so loud my daughter woke up in the middle of the night, and when I went to comfort her, he told me to get out of her room and he was going to drag me out by my hair. And I remember staring at him as he was about to leave my house and finally feeling I could see for the first time. And I just knew it wasn't me. And I did leave him almost 3 years ago, but he's continued to stalk me. And I still need to share custody with him. So I still have to see him regularly and email him, and he has my phone number. And I've done a lot of healing, a lot of thanks to CORA, where we've just been so fantastically supported. But my healing isn't over because I still have to see my rapist on a regular basis. And I still have to send my children to visit with a man who would pin me down outside of their room and beat my face and rape me and then tell me it's my fault. So this talking out loud, my friends say telling the truth as loud as you can is the thing that I do that is the most healing. So thank you for being here to hear that, because for me, the louder I can say, this is what happened, and this is how it happened, and this is how we need to fix things so that it doesn't happen to other people, that is where I feel like I am a whole person again, and I'm no longer under anybody's control, and I can shape my own destiny and hopefully help other people on the way.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jessica. That was extraordinary, really. We're next going to hear from CORA, which Jessica mentioned in her remarks. CORA is Community Overcoming Relationship Abuse. It's the only provider of comprehensive intimate partner abuse prevention services in San Mateo County. It's been around for 40 years in San Mateo County, has served about 12,000 people per year, and it has a new executive director, Colsaria Henderson, who joined CORA in September. She brings 20 years of experience in anti-violence work and deep experience in domestic violence program development, advocacy, and policy change. Colsaria?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for inviting us all here tonight and for helping to keep this issue in the forefront of people's minds. So, my name is Colsaria Henderson, and I am the Executive Director at CORA, Community Overcoming Relationship Abuse here in San Mateo County. And as the Congresswoman said, we are a social justice, multi-service, anti-oppression organization that is really focused on support and healing and overall ending this work, ending the violence that we see in our community, and particularly intimate partner abuse and violence. I would just like to spend a second to talk tonight about sort of what survivors are facing across this country and across our, and in our county, just locally. The importance of believing survivors and the importance of and the importance of talking about what we see at the national and local level, it must stay in the forefront of our minds. Every day in our neighbors, our friends, our moms in the carpool, our dads that are dropping kids off at baseball, families are suffering, and they're suffering often in silence. And every day we are ignoring the fact that people are choosing whether or not they provide food for their children or whether they actually access safety. Every day in our county, because of our housing crisis that we have in Silicon Valley, survivors of violence, as these two brave women have talked about, are choosing to live and be in a situation simply because the housing is not available for them and a safe option is not there. We have work to do as a community. We have work to do as a society. And yet we're still faced with the issues that we saw on the national level, where we are just trying to bring to light that these issues are happening. We have seen very recently that we are constantly still fighting on the state and local level for adequate funding My partners over here from Rape Trauma Services know very well that sexual assault in our state just got some of the first funding in decades given on our statewide level. We are still asking for crumbs in order to make services for what we have, for the thousands upon thousands that we are seeing across our counties that need our help and support. We need funding for prevention. We need to focus on ending this violence as well as serving. And so we have work to do in this county, and we have work to do on the state and national level. And I just want to lastly implore you that in addition, and what we haven't seen and talked about yet up here in this panel, is that we also see survivors who are undocumented, that are unsafe, that do not feel safe to access, even with great partners like law enforcement agencies and the district attorney's office that have to choose between whether they're going to face deportation or whether they're going to access food and clothing and safety. We have work to do. And so I would just like to use my time here to say that we have a call to action here. And that's what I heard from Dr. Ford. And that's what is that we have a call to action, and now is the time. Now is the time for us to stand up and figure out how we can support our community, how we can support our families, our neighbors, our friends, through our churches, our synagogues, how we can begin to advocate for the rights. We see our LGBTQ survivors that are scared to access services. We have work to do. And so I would just implore you that to find a way to talk to folks, find a way to talk to your community, your neighbors, through your spiritual guide, whether that's your churches or your synagogues, through your community groups, through your moms groups, your little leagues, whatever it might be, because we have work to do. And while we all sit up here and we work every day in this field, we need your help. We are a community, and we are part of that, but we need your help. Thank you.
Thank you, Catharine. I'm pleased to say that the police chief for the city of San Mateo is here. Please stand. Our next speaker is Amanda LeBlanc Freeman. She is the program director at the Rape Trauma Service, the only rape crisis center in San Mateo County. And this particular program has been operating in San Mateo County for 26 years and works closely with CORA. Amanda, too, has over 20 years of experience advocating for trauma survivors. She's a certified sexual assault counselor and has found her true calling in advocacy and prevention. Amanda, tell us about the work RTS does and also the increase in call volume that you have witnessed since the Crosby and Kavanaugh hearings.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I see some of our community out there, and I just want to say thank you. Some of our amazing volunteers are in the audience tonight, so thank you so much. I think that one of the things that has struck Rape Trauma Services since the Bill Cosby sentencing and the Kavanaugh hearings is the overwhelming sense of rage that has gone through survivors and people who love survivors. To hear Dr. Ford say that what she remembers most about her assault was the laughter, and then to have our leader make fun of her and have people laugh at her is a real learning moment for our community, because what that means is that it's not safe to come forward. That if you don't come forward in the way that our leadership has decided is acceptable, then you're not going to be believed, and you are going to get death threats. And that is a sad, sad statement of the 24 years of helping thousands of survivors within San Mateo County. We are lucky, we are grateful for our amazing law enforcement and district attorney partners. I have all faith that that would not happen here in San Mateo County. However, that doesn't mean that the first person that they tell might be a family or friend who might ask them a why question. We still always investigate the survivor as well as the perpetrator. And we have believability issues that are very difficult. And so we need, as you said, to come together in our community. Our housing crisis has created a perfect storm for pedophilia.
Wow.
People are living with many, many families, and because they are working so many jobs, they often have to rely upon strangers or even people who they love to care for their children. And as CORA said, they are often choosing between homelessness and believing their children. We have so much to do, and we want to honor the bravery of every survivor who comes forward. Our mission has been to believe survivors, and we do it every day. We've had over a 300% increase in our service calls since the Kavanaugh hearings. People who are calling in their 80s and 90s who have never spoken their truth before and need someone to know. And as you said, we need you. We need volunteers, we need donors, we need the corporations and the technology of this valley to get invested in this work. We need your help. We need you to support the survivors in your own life. And if you are a survivor, to understand that it's not your fault. That nothing you can ever do can cause anyone to commit a crime against you. And that RTS is here. We have a 24-hour crisis line. Our office is open every day. You can come in, you can talk to someone, and be believed. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I left some squeezy hearts on the back table over there. If you'd like to take them. Talking about sexual violence is very difficult, and so we like to bring things with us.
Thank you, Amanda. We'll get back to that jarring headline of increase in pedophilia because of the housing situation, but let's move on. Start writing your questions down so that she'll be able to ask them. I've got to tell you, I am really thrilled to introduce our next speaker. I've known her for a number of years. She is a rock star in this area. She is going to provide us with a historic and legal perspective on sex inequality and abuse of women. Professor Catharine MacKinnon is a well-known lawyer, teacher, writer, activist on sexual equality issues domestically and internationally. She's currently the James Barr Ames Visiting Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and she has been the first special gender advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She, ranks up there with Gloria Steinem and some of the other rock stars in the women's community, and I'm just so honored that she has joined us tonight. Professor?
I'm really honored to be here and to share this panel with all the people who have spoken so far. And the central question that we were asked to talk about is domestic violence. But as has been clear from what everyone has said so far, it overlaps with and combines and synthesizes so many crimes, particularly against women and children. They all happen within what is called domestic violence, and also so many of the dynamics within it are in common with all these other issues. And just the thought that came to me listening to everyone is that what is considered to be distinctions among issues, for example, sexual abuse of children, as was mentioned, and I'm also put in mind of sex trafficking and prostitution. What the distinction between so-called domestic violence when people are thinking mainly about physical force being used and rape, even though it's very common to be raped, as was clear in a situation of domestic violence, that there's something about the separations between these issues that have been laid on to them by people, not us, people, not you, people to whom it did not happen, actually, quite honestly, more likely people who did it, that those distinctions end up being divisions among women. They end up being walls so that people think I'm a domestic violence victim, but I wasn't raped, or I was raped by someone who manipulated me financially. I couldn't leave because I couldn't support my children otherwise, but I'm really different from the woman who is being pimped on the street corner because she can't otherwise support her family and her children and has been homeless. And the only way she isn't at the moment, or maybe she even still is by continuing to do that. So that the way I think about all these forms of abuse is that they're crimes of inequality. And the inequalities are multiple and layered and pile up on people. It's economic inequality, it's very often race-based and ethnic inequality that makes people at heightened levels of vulnerability to economic discrimination and to a familial history where any wealth that was in that family has been stolen from it by people of other ethnicities. So that puts people in already a one-down position when it comes to being able to fight back against these forms of abuse. And it also involves age, which the younger you are, when you're a child, you are physically weaker, you have no economic ability, you can't vote, you can't leave. And so when all these forms of abuse that are being discussed are happening to you, it can be called sexual abuse of children. It can happen, however, within a domestic violence situation. The children are being raped, and often the mothers are being raped. But then what you've got later on in life is not a different group of people who you then find in domestic violence or being sold and pimped on street corners. It's the same group of people at a different point in time where, the abuse has been normalized and they've been told no one would want them. They've been told they have no options. They encounter economic discrimination in the workforce, which is rampant still. And combined there often with race and ethnicity and sometimes forms of disability. And then physical force is exerted on them. And this whole system typically operates through gender in a way that differentially impacts women and girls. But it also happens to little boys. If you want to see somebody treated a lot the way women are, little boys are that group. And so I just want to underline that all these forms of inequality pile up, they come together, and they converge in a vortex that is sexual abuse. And when people talk about sexual violence, often they're thinking about it as either an isolated crime or a unidimensional event or something that is exceptional or off the edge of what happens normally in life, when in fact it is deeply embedded in the structures of inequality of this society. It's because of those inequalities that it becomes possible. And then we have all the same prefabricated excuses for not believing someone. She's a slut, she's a nut. And if those things don't work, the next thing is, so what? And So I actually want to say that it's true that people often aren't believed, but frankly, I think a lot of people do believe people who say they're sexually abused. I think most people believed Dr. Blasey. I think so. What we've got to confront is that a lot of people thought it didn't matter, that he was lying to them, and we are putting him on the Supreme Court. And I don't believe her, as was said about Anita Hill, for example, and with every passing day, more people say they do. I think they believed her then. They were saying they didn't think it should count because white men were not held to that standard. Okay? So it's just a matter, this belief business, which is unreviewable in court, you know, especially. I mean, a judge says, oh, I didn't believe her. You don't have any appeal from that. It works that way in society, too. People just say, oh, I don't believe that person, and that's the end of it. I just want to say that I think people do know that this happens. I think they do believe the survivors. They just don't think we count. They think we're worthless. They think that whatever is going to be done to him because of believing what we said shouldn't be done because we don't matter and he does. It's either way in the past, so it's how long ago was that, so it should, there's a weird temporality to this stuff. It should disappear because it's way in the past. That doesn't count. But you know what really does count? His future. Okay? Her present doesn't count. Her past doesn't count. Her future doesn't count. I'm just saying this is about the trivializing, dehumanization, the valuelessness of having been sexually abused and violated, which is sort of central to the definition of what it is to be a woman under situations of sex inequality, which we still are under. So that would just be a thought.
See what I mean? All right, now we're going to hear from law enforcement. And I'm happy to introduce someone I've known for a very long time here in San Mateo County. Al Serrato is the Chief Deputy District Attorney in the county, in the DA's office. He's been in the office for 31 years. What makes him particularly special in my mind is he didn't leave the domestic violence beat. He has been a prosecutor in the office and has been in charge of domestic violence prosecutions throughout his career. And he supervises now 5 domestic violence deputy district attorneys and is an active member of the county's Domestic Violence Council. So, Al, please help us.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's a topic that have been passionate about for most of my career. In the early 90s, when my hair wasn't white, I was exposed to DV prosecution in a serious attempted murder case, and it shaped my development as a prosecutor. Maggie was a 25-year-old nurse who had the great misfortune of falling in love with a man who was possessive, jealous, controlling, and that relationship didn't move forward well for her. She became frightened as she started to see his true side and wanted to distance herself from him, and that's when it turned to violence, to pushing, shoving, low-end stuff like that at first, and then the hand on the neck, putting pressure on the throat, telling her by actions and by words that he could take her life, and that he would. And she tried to separate from him and eventually thought that she had. But unfortunately, one Sunday morning, as Maggie was heading off to work, he was waiting for her behind a car, and he stabbed her repeatedly, brutally. And Maggie's alive today only because of the great skill of the surgeons who saved her life. And we went to trial. She was very brave and got through it, and he went to prison on a life sentence for attempted first-degree murder. And as I got to know Maggie better, I asked her at one point, why didn't you report this sooner? He was doing things that are criminal, pushing you, shoving you, strangling you, threatening you. And she looked at me and she said, because I didn't think anyone would believe me. And that's exactly what he was telling her. The police can't stop me. I'm not afraid of them. I will never let you go. And they won't believe you anyway. You don't have any marks on you. No one's going to believe what you're saying. And so I knew then that we needed to do a lot as a system to change that if we could. And we've come a long way in the ensuing 20 or so years. It was a time that law enforcement was reevaluating its approach to domestic violence investigations and prosecutions. No more were we going to have police go to the same scenes, tell people essentially, why don't you take a walk around the block or go to a hotel. If we saw signs of domestic violence, the police were going to make arrests, we were going to prosecute. And so a couple of years later, in mid-90s, we started a domestic violence unit in my office, and I volunteered to be one of the prosecutors to do that. That was before we had victim advocates that Rosa mentioned earlier. And so I spent that first year speaking with victims, with survivors on a daily basis and seeing the very compelling reasons why they stay. The fear, the dependence economically, the hopelessness that there's no one there to help them. And the feeling, at least in some of them, that every man is like that. I had a few tell me, I'm sure you beat your wife as well, you just get away with it because of who you are. And that really shocked me. And so since then, we've added domestic violence victim advocates. In fact, today in the audience is Elisa Kuhl, who is our victim service manager there. She's waving. And I'm sure she'd be happy afterwards to answer any questions. She leads a team of 10 or more advocates of various types. But we have right now 2 dedicated domestic violence victim advocates who help from the very beginning with directing them toward help, to therapy, financial help, court accompaniment, to doing those things to personalize this process, because believe me, that court process that Maggie went through was traumatic for her. And I spent a lot of time helping her get through that, and I wished I had advocates back then to assist me with that process. So in this Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I am so encouraged that the Congresswoman is bringing this panel together and that you're shining a light on this and helping that message go out that we do believe victims. We have a task in front of us for many survivors. Many cases are difficult to prove, but we put a team together to try to support them in these traumatic times and to help them through it. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So police officers are often the very first people to interact with the perpetrator and the victim in a domestic violence crisis. In fact, most law enforcement officers will tell you they're the most dangerous calls that they are sent out on. Lieutenant Ryan Monaghan is a 20-year veteran of the San Mateo Police Department under Chief Mannheimer. And he has thousands of hours investigating domestic violence cases. He was involved in CORA's initiative to assess and provide recommendations to enhance the multidisciplinary and coordinated approach the county uses to address intimate partner violence. He has also conducted numerous trainings on the issue. Ryan, I'd like for you to take us into one of the crisis settings and explain what to do and what not to do.
First off, thank you, Congresswoman, for having us here and for putting this panel together to talk about an extremely important topic. And also my thanks to the survivors, Rosa and Jessica, to have the courage to be up here to talk about things that we know in law enforcement are very, very difficult for victims to talk about. So in response to your question, Congresswoman, these are very difficult calls for law enforcement to respond to, and you've alluded to some of the very reasons why. They're very emotionally charged situations. When our officers go into them, that is in fact very true. These are some of the most dangerous situations that officers can respond to because, again, they're very volatile, and we do know that in many times the victims can quickly turn because there's a lot of explanations for why. And It's the fact that you're now taking away, in many cases, the person that is paying the bills, that's helping them take care of the kids, that's putting a roof over their head. And we do know in these situations that many of the abusers, there's a pattern and there's a cycle, and they make those victims very, very dependent on them. And so we know that makes these situations extremely dangerous for us. What we always try to do when we respond to those situations, before the officers even knock on the door, we're using our senses to try to understand what's going on. We're listening, we're watching. We really want to make sure that we handle this as safely as possible, not only for the officers, but we also know in many of these cases, there's family members and oftentimes young children. I can't tell you how many times in my many years in this business, responding to a domestic violence call to be met by a young child who clung to my leg, crying hysterically, and because I was the only thing stopping the abuse at that moment in time. And I think so many of our officers experience that. So it really is important. And what we always ask is, when someone is in this situation and they've gotten the courage to make that difficult call, provide as much information as possible. Try to separate yourself from the abuser. Try to get to a place that's safe so that you can be in a safe location to tell the officers what happened. Try to get your children out of the location if you can do so. So those are really the things we try to encourage people is don't be scared to tell us what's going on. And we know that many times it's difficult. And I'll walk you through. I think Al alluded to this. He touched upon a story that he had with a domestic violence victim that was almost killed. Well, I can tell you in my 20 plus years of experience in law enforcement that I have responded to domestic violence calls where we worked with the victim and the cycle of violence continued only to eventually respond back out to a homicide. It's very touching for us. We just recently had a case that we finished up in trial where one of our detectives worked tirelessly with a family, a girl by the name of Colleen Straw. This young woman had a boyfriend that she really thought she could fix. She thought she could change him. He had a lot of problems. Colleen wanted to be there for him. And unfortunately, one morning, under a rage, he went into her house and brutally killed her, and basically slashed her, and she was able to make the 911 call before she died and tell us who was responsible for the crime. And I can tell you that, going to this hearing the other day when they finally gave the sentence to the suspect, we become very attached to the families because we take that journey with them. And we realize that now that Colleen is gone, we are now her voice. And the detective, I know for a fact, the detective that worked that case, this is a detective that has his own family at home. And I'm telling you that it's hard not to take that stuff home. It's hard not to see that family's anguish. And so, but the good news is really that, in this county, we have come a very long way in law enforcement. Earlier today, Chief Mannheimer and I were talking, and she was talking about her times, and sometime back in the 1980s or around there, maybe 1990s, 80s, something like that. So, but when she began in this business, they would respond to domestic violence calls, and hey, okay, you go your way, and everyone's okay, right? Well, as Al alluded to, the laws changed. We got a little bit more serious about it. When I came into law enforcement in the 1990s, we definitely had a more aggressive approach in the stance of prosecuting suspects. But again, almost to the point where if a victim didn't want to cooperate, well, that's okay, we'll just make her cooperate. Back then, well, they can be held in contempt of court. Well, that's even changed, right? Because we know now that that's not the way to handle these types of situations, and that's not going to get us the level of cooperation that we need. And so now, where we're at today, we've really taken a deep dive into this topic. And in this county, we're fortunate. We have very progressive chiefs like Chief Mannheimer and several other chiefs in this county that take this issue very seriously. They understand the dynamics behind it, and they provide us with a lot of training, a lot of specialized training, and a lot of resources to make sure that we're handling these appropriately. We're also very fortunate because we have amazing partnerships. We have RTS. I know Amanda. I've worked with her on multiple projects. We have the victim advocates from the DA's office. We have CORA. It truly is a partnership, and it's wraparound services that we're able to provide the victims. And we can't fight this fight without that help in law enforcement. You need to be able to provide advocacy. You need to be able to say that, hey, you need to get out of this situation, and we're going to help you find a place to stay. And we're going to help you take care of your children. And we're going to reach out to our partners to make sure that you're okay. So I think we've come a long way because that's where we're at today. And it really, I look at my progression through my career. And as Congresswoman alluded to, we were San Mateo and several other agencies in the county, Daly City Police Department, Redwood City, kind of some of the bigger agencies took a leading role in this. We were part of what was called the DVCCR project, which is domestic violence community, overcoming community relationship abuse. And really what that project was taking a deep dive into the collaborative services that we provide here in San Mateo County to victims of domestic violence, and seeing and assessing how are we doing, and is there room to enhance this and do it even better. And so it was great that San Mateo and again in Daly City and some of these other agencies were part of this project, because what we learned from that is that we were doing a lot of things right, but we needed a lot more focus on children. And I know that Professor MacKinnon alluded to this. The children are also victims in these situations. And whether or not they were actually, whether or not they were there at the night of the incident or not is kind of irrelevant. I mean, our officers now are so detailed in their reporting. They're finding out who the children are, how old are they, how long have they been exposed to this environment. If there's charges that are applicable, criminal charges, we're going to pursue those for the children because we have to be the advocates for the children. But more importantly, we're getting them connected to services. We're getting those children connected to services because we know that they are being traumatized. Whether they're hearing it, whether they're witnessing it, whether mom and dad are being separated. So we understand that there's trauma to these children and that we have to have a very trauma-centered approach. And I would say again that we're very lucky in this county. We also have a very supportive DA's office that very aggressively pursues these cases. And I know that for our officers that means a lot, because I can tell you that every one of our officers has a vested interest in stopping violence. It's frustrating for them to go back to the same house with a victim and only to find them in the same situation. But today, they're a lot more aware of why that is. They're a lot more aware of the dynamics taking place there and why the victim might want to stay in that situation. And the officers are a lot more victim-centric in their approach, very trauma-informed, and really are reaching out to these victims to get cooperation. And so, it's been an evolution. I think it will continue to be an evolution for us because we're learning more and more. We're putting more and more services into place. I know in San Mateo alone, a few years back, one of the initiatives that we did was we created what we call our Special Victims Unit. And what we really focused on with our Special Victims Unit was domestic violence victims. And the reason why is we identify them as special victims because there are these really special and unique dynamics in a domestic violence situation that oftentimes makes it difficult for the victim to leave that situation. And you have to understand those dynamics, and you have to consider those dynamics when you're conducting an investigation. And so we've done that. We've trained. We know that there's been a significant amount of training in this county on domestic violence strangulation. Congresswoman alluded to the fact of a firearms use. There's statistics out there that if a woman is strangled in a domestic violence, or a woman or a man, but in most of the cases we see the victims are in fact women, they're about 21 times more likely to become a victim of a homicide. And in this county, they sent a whole corps of us down to the Family Justice Center in San Diego, and we received very specialized training in domestic violence strangulation cases, the best in the nation. And that was with CORA, the DA's office, and so that we can, again, really look at this from a collaborative approach and make sure that we're providing all those services for the victims. And since that training, we've seen a lot more reports of strangulation, not because they're just happening more frequently, because our officers are trained on what to look for, and they're asking the right questions, and they're getting that information. And every time we intervene in one of those situations, we look at it as a life saved. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Wow, thank you. Pretty powerful panel, right? All right, we're now available for questions you may have. And Ragda from my staff will be providing you with a microphone. There's one over there. You should all know my staff did an extraordinary job putting this together. Katrina Rill, thank you. Sarah Alperton. Stephanie Morales, and Brian Perkins, and Ragda. Okay.
My question, it's concerning the Violence Against Women Act. I did some research on that, and I know that it's in a precarious position right now, as you alluded to. And I realized that since 1994, it hasn't had this issue about being, it's never been in this a precarious position. And when I was researching it, I discovered that there was also something included in this act that has firearms. Anybody who I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but it has to do with perpetrators. If there's something that has gone on legally with particular victims, that the perpetrator has restrictions in terms of having availability to firearms. Now, if this doesn't pass, or if it gets dropped, then that provision in this act is going to not exist anymore. Is that correct?
So, I believe VAWA will pass. One of the areas that has become, and you're absolutely right, it has been totally bipartisan with every renewal up until 2013, when it started to have some issues. We had a Republican majority in the House and a growing Republican majority in the Senate. They particularly didn't want to provide services to undocumented women and Native American women. So, you know, it's hard to believe that those are the kinds of issues that end up tripping up something that is so vitally necessary. Now, both those populations should be served. And so the Democrats hold out so that we can, in fact, provide services to those populations. And then my Republican colleagues, some of them, not all of them, some of them kind of hold back, which then doesn't give us the opportunity to get to a majority. But I do think it will be renewed for the length of time that's appropriate. Now, in terms of guns, and maybe we can have some assistance from law enforcement, I've always thought that if you had a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction, you can't get a gun moving forward, but the guns that you may have should be taken away from you. And that is not always the case. I don't know if that is the case now.
Well, it is. It's changed. Proposition 63. So a conviction for any kind of battery, including domestic violence-related offenses, creates a prohibition about possessing firearms and a requirement that the person identify if they have any firearms and surrender them. And there's a process in place for the probation department to author a search warrant if we believe that they in fact have a weapon. So that issue that you raised was dealt with via Prop 63.
In California.
In California. We enforce state law. I don't know if Ryan has more info on the enforcement part of that, but that is the law now.
No more really than, yes, we do enforce that strictly. It's one of the things that we do in every domestic violence. If there is weapons, it's one of the questions that's standardly asked by the officers at the scene if there's weapons. Yep. And routinely at that point in time, they will have the suspect in the case surrender the weapons. And there is a process that takes place for that, as Al alluded to.
But isn't it true that it's for a period of time?
The prohibition, I think, is 10 years for
is that
a
right?
misdemeanor conviction. But the relinquishment occurs. I mean, it's supposed to occur. Most of the forms I see, and they indicate they don't have firearms, not just DV, but just across the board. And so there's a limit practically to what we can do to enforce something like that. We can run registration to see if guns are registered to someone, but we can't automatically get search warrants without some probable cause that there is a weapon there. So we're making progress.
Yes.
I was just going to mention that San Mateo County actually has done an amazing job at this and is actually leading in California for this. So a lot of counties do not actually have a way to enforce the relinquishment. And San Mateo County has worked really hard specifically to be able to look at relinquishment, and particularly in the cases of domestic violence restraining orders. So I just think that needs to be said, because we are still, that is a constant fight that is still going across California, and which, again, we are here leading the nation.
And I'll just add that we're very fortunate at our sheriff's office. They help us quite frequently in these cases where we need to confiscate weapons. They have a unit that's all they do, is they work on confiscating weapons.
If, in fact, a proposition has been passed in California, shouldn't it apply to all the counties? Tell us why it's not enforced.
Well, so the law, it, of course, applies to all the counties.
Right.
But the difference is that my opinion of this is that the different, and our law enforcement partners might be able to explain a little more, but that most counties aren't putting the financial backing towards having a unit to actually enforce this in that process. And so it really, again, might go a lot to what you were sharing, that it's prioritization.
And in our world, it's very similar to the, to the sex offender registry, right, which is an unfunded, right? Megan's Law is an unfunded mandate, and so it is something that where federal law is passed and even California law is passed, and there is no money put toward it, there is no funding put toward it to ensure that it is done. And frankly, we have a culture where people are not becoming police officers and where they are not joining your ranks, and so we have underserved things that people really believe in, like Megan's Law, like other things. So I think that, there's definitely work to be done. What I wanted to say about VAWA is that VAWA is not the only stream that funds both of our agencies. The other one is the Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA. And VOCA is funded through restitution. And restitution is paid by white-collar criminals. And so given what is happening with the Justice Department, we believe that those funds will be gone in probably 10 years. And every skinny budget that we have seen since 2016 has cut both VAWA and VOCA completely. And it's only because of the advocacy of Congresspeople, bipartisan sometimes, mostly Democrats, that that it goes back into the budget. And so there are absolute losses to the advocacy community every single time this happens.
Can you tell us what your budgets are, each of your budgets, and how much staff you have?
Yeah, we're a very small agency. We're 11 staff, 65 volunteers, and we 1.3 million. So very, very small.
CORA is a little larger, so we have just over 50 staff at this point, and we have, we're about 4.3 million, and a lot of that goes towards our emergency shelter, emergency housing programs, and we also operate 2 24-hour hotlines, one specifically for law enforcement to be able to reach us and provide services for when they go out, and another one specifically for survivors and victims and folks that might want to call for other information, and those types of services are funded under those 2 programs and through our state funding, and it is definitely a precarious place for us to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I also think that, we rely so heavily on our community to be part of this. We respond to the Keller Center for Family Violence Intervention, which is our site for medical legal exams or rape kits. I should also give a shout out that San Mateo County does not have a backlog of rape kits. Our crime lab Our crime lab is incredible. They pick up evidence, they process it. They are working so hard to make sure that, and we're one of the few counties in California where that does not happen. And also, we respond 600 times a year to the Keller Center, RTS. 600 for children, for women, for men, in both sexual assaults and domestic violence situations. If they need an advocate, we are there 24 hours a day.
And that's at the San Mateo County General Hospital.
Yeah, medical center now.
Oh, that's right. Keep changing names. It
It's CHOPE.
Used to be CHOPE when I was on the board.
Everybody, exactly. CHOPE. That's right. Yep.
All right, next question.
Hi, my name is Jenny, and I'm a resident of San Mateo County. I get in the habit of saying that every time. First of all, thank you, Congresswoman Speier, for hosting this. Thank you to all of the panelists for participating, especially the brave women who have been victims. It takes a lot to come forward and do this work on a daily basis, and those who take the calls. I'm really, really impressed with this panel. And Professor MacKinnon brought it together in so far as these are all interrelated issues. And I really like that line of thinking because we must see it that way. And unfortunately, it seems to me that I'm getting to my question, the least privileged have the least access to justice still. You know, we fight this every day, and I think you see it every day. So my question really is about back to this undocumented workers, undocumented victims. You know, how do they get assurance that they call the police and the police aren't going to contact the sheriff's office, who's then going to contact ICE because they have this thing going on, despite SB 54, despite some of the momentum, despite, I mean, who knows about SB 54 really, unless they've been caught up in the system and got an opportunity to experience some of the benefits. So that's kind of my question: is how do we not do that?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. In law enforcement, yeah, as you know, California is a sanctuary state, and so for us in law enforcement, you know, our role isn't to enforce immigration. That's not what our role is. Our role is to keep the people in our community safe, period, regardless of what their immigration status is. That's not what we concern ourselves with. If an arrest is made, you know, it's not our role to know if someone's status in this country is not a question that we would even be asking them. So it's not something that's going to come up. It's not something that you know, because again, that's, you know, we stay within our scope. It is not our role in local law enforcement to be involved with that. So,
and the problem, unfortunately, is it's beyond our control because the perpetrator of the crime might know of a victim status and they will make the threat, just like in the case I was telling you about of a defendant telling someone, you know, it's not going to matter, no one's going to believe you, they're going to arrest you. None of that's true, but it's hard for us to counter a message like that.
That's correct, yeah.
I would just say that, so our services aren't contingent upon whether on someone's status either, right? So and so as service providers in this county, it is really important for us to get the word out to tell people that regardless of whether you want to report to law enforcement. So law enforcement is one way to go, and and the criminal justice system is there, and when we have excellent folks that are taking this issue very seriously, that's wonderful. But a lot of survivors do not want to report. They will not go near the criminal justice system, and that there are still services available regardless of your status, regardless of whether or not you want to report or not. And then the other piece that I would say about undocumented population is that we have other problems around that in this county, in this state, and in this country, and so that will still be preventative. So even though our services, there's nothing contingent upon our services for you to access all of the work, all of the emergency shelter, all of the hotline, all of the children's, our children's program, our mental health programs. Like, even though that is not necessary, there is federal funding for some pieces, like some housing programs, where undocumented folks cannot access those programs. And the multi-service programs like RTS and CORA here try to look at other ways and access other different a multitude of funding so that we can still support families and survivors, regardless of whether that federal funding, we have that federal funding or not. And so I think we also see an impact on undocumented families, specifically around whether or not they can access CalFresh, right, or CalWorks, right? So which is our TANF programs, our food and financial assistance programs. And so we also see that affect whether or not people can come forward, whether or not they can access supportive services that they would need to get around the economic issues around whether or not I leave an abusive situation. And so it is part of the work that amazing advocates do every single day in both RTS and CORA is literally to help navigate those systems and help families still find a way to access supportive services.
And I think what's most important.
Oh, sorry. I could just guess. What you observed about what I said, it's completely the case that at the core of all of these abuses is when it is sexual, it's sex imposed by someone with more power on someone with less. And so the source of the more and less varies with the inequality, but immigration status is a huge one.
Yes.
And, it also at sort of the center of all these overlaps is, of course, sexual harassment. I mean, the reason that many people stay in employment situations where they're being sexually harassed is an economic imposition. It's economic force. And then they're told that they must have consented to it because they stayed, and it's similar, this, why doesn't she leave is the question for battered women. Why doesn't she report, or why did she stay is the question for sexually harassed women. And, the answers are the same: lack of alternatives, lack of real options. The whole idea, if I was being treated that badly, I wouldn't stay for the next 5 minutes. Well, look, that's just a victim blaming, pernicious form of psychologizing by people who haven't been in those situations and actually aren't probably ever going to be. So,
I also want to say that, RTS made so we want to surround the work with people who culturally and linguistically understand these communities. And so we have a saying that we meet survivors where they are, and we mean that not only psychologically but geographically. So we had a client who was coming from East Palo Alto to our office in Burlingame and missed a 9 o'clock bus. And so was not going to be able to make it to her 1 o'clock appointment in Burlingame and had to take an entire day off work to have a peer counseling session for 50 minutes. So we use everything that we have culturally, linguistically to have people in communities that are trusted, so that when this does happen in a community, because it's not just about policy, it's about what's understood about policy. And so...
Hey, Amanda, let's go on to some more questions. But before we get to the next question, I'd like to ask Jessica and Rosa a question. Were there any clues, looking back at it now, any clues before you got married that depicted any violence?
No, I didn't see any.
Yes, so many.
Go ahead.
So many. Of course, I didn't see any of this at the time, so I'm trying not to feel too guilty that I didn't. But now that I've read about how abusers work and I understand, now I look back and say, wow, he bought me these weirdly expensive presents really early in our relationship that didn't really make sense and I wasn't really comfortable with. And it changed a power dynamic in doing so. And that was something I really didn't pick up on for quite a while. And then there was also your friends, or this particular friend is just not a great person for you. All of these are very classic things, but they start so slowly that it's a gas leak. You don't pick up on them until there's quite a serious pattern. Those are the two that really come to mind. The earliest in the relationship before we even got married, I now see as red flags.
But a lot of men buy women weird, expensive presents, and they don't end up beating them on the face and raping them on the floor next to the children's room,
This is true. At the time, I was a single mom on welfare, and suddenly he was buying me iPods and stuff. And I was like, oh, I don't really feel comfortable with that because I have nothing to my name. That's a little bit excessive. But he really insisted. And
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.
Rosa. Okay, next question.
Okay. Hi, my name's Connie, and I'm a relatively new resident to San Mateo County. First of all, I want to thank you, Congressman Speier, for doing this very important panel, and it's great to be in such a progressive county. I want to ask, first of all, if we're going to encourage women to report sexual violence, we need to also make sure that they have the confidence that their report will be taken seriously and that actions will be taken. Sadly, in my own family, that didn't happen. When my son, who has autism, was sexually assaulted by his live-in caregiver, I had the assistant DA come out a couple times to assess whether he could actually testify in court. Did he have enough ability to do that? When my daughter reported at her university that she was assaulted, the administrators did nothing. In my own marriage, when I went to attorneys, and I was in a very long-term marriage, they said, well, the abuse occurred too far back. You can't really use any of that. And yet there was all forms of abuse. What I've learned after attending a DV group for a number of years in another county is that there's many different types of domestic violence. So you've got sexual, you've got physical, you've got emotional, psychological, you've got financial, and then there's finally the litigation abuse that can go on after, when you're in the middle of a divorce. Let's drain all of your funds. So I guess my question is having had these experiences with the judicial system, what can we do to educate the judges and the attorneys so that women can feel comfortable coming forward? Because what I see is it's not working for my family. So that's my question.
All right, Professor.
Well, I would start with the resources that you have here right now. It's not, I'm not here to defend the legal system, believe me. And obviously, it has failed you repeatedly. Whether we can do something at this point to get you to better resources, I think, is the question that comes to my mind. And they're sitting here, 1, 2, 3, 4 on my left.
I would just say that, one, thank you, right? Thank you for telling your story. Thank you for telling an intergenerational story, right? And so often that's the case in our families. I would say that I hope that we are working towards that not happening. And I think with our partners and in this county, I think that that's definitely the goal, is that we get better at it, right? As a system, we get better at being able to take this abuse and this violence very seriously, right? And safety very seriously. I would also say that we're getting better at having resources when it's not taken seriously. And I'm going to call out someone in the audience. There is the executive director of the Family Violence Appellate Project, which is a phenomenal organization that specifically works on appeals for issues that don't turn out the right way, that works, around the court systems to ensure, right, that we are working towards having better resources in our court, having court reporters to essentially be able to tell us the story of what's happened in court so that an appeal can happen. So they've worked very, very closely with the domestic violence agencies in this state to ensure that we, and many other partners, to ensure that we are also beginning to correct some of the wrongs that quite frankly, our court and justice system has done in the past. So I hope that overall, as a process and as a community, that we will get to a place where my daughter and my kids are safer, right? And where our next generation won't experience the same horrific examples that you gave. Thank you.
I would just note that society is a trauma center at this point. That it's just, for years and years, and, men abused as little boys and growing up and they're like full men now, and it doesn't even dawn on anybody that could have happened to them. And, they're walking around and, the numbers are staggering. And the best studies have been done on this were done in San Francisco. And so we know that if you have, say, 46% of women, all women, this is in 1977, having been sexually abused at least once, having been raped actually, or victims of attempted rape at least once in their lives. And then you add to that the numbers of people who don't necessarily remember each and every abuse going back in their own history. And that then multiplies and that doesn't even count how many are abused before they reach the age of majority in terms of simple sexual molestation in contact forms. And so what it is you described is less exceptional, I think, than it may seem to people hearing it. That is, I get people, what did somebody say? They need someone to know, so they tell you. Well, I seem to be that person who gets told because people need someone to know a thing, right? So I've been getting told this for 45 years. And both the epidemic nature of it is starting to become clear with this Me Too movement. The endemic nature of it is what I think we really need to look at.
I would just want to add, as the prosecutor, that you should have your voice heard. Don't be silent. If I heard that one of my assistant DAs or prosecutors was callous toward a victim who had come forward, I would take action on that person. It's not acceptable in the culture of my office. Having said that, we work in a legal system, so there are times when there isn't sufficient corroboration. There is a presumption of innocence. There are many rules and laws that are arrayed against us when we try to move forward in a case. But we need to communicate that message that we do believe you and that we have a team of people that are working to try to see that justice is done. And if we can't do it, to explain it to you in a way that is befitting of the dignity of every human being. So make your voice heard like you're doing tonight.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I have a pretty general question for Jessica and Rosa. In your opinion, what is the next best course of action for us as a society to take to reduce domestic violence?
Oh, cool. Hi. Here's what I would really love all of you to do, and then make everyone else you know do, that would really be helpful. Read about how abusers work. Get the Lundy Bancroft book, Why Does He Do That? Buy it and put it in a public bathroom somewhere. I'm not even kidding. That changed my life, and it gave me the terminology to talk about what was happening to me. And then the second book I need you all to read and give to everyone you know and put in every public bathroom is The Body Keeps the Score. This is talking about what abuse does as far as PTSD. And I really think it would be helpful if bystander society, everyone else, had a better understanding of what someone with post-traumatic stress disorder looks like, what they act like, what their symptoms are, and how their brain is working. Because so many of the questions I think people have about why this or why that or why'd you do that are actually answered because it's a neurological injury, and we have a lot of information on how that works. So do that. And then if people come to you, believe them. Just believe them. Just say, the most helpful things I've ever heard when I've told people is simply, I believe you. That's really the most helpful thing, because we're walking around in a society, and especially with the way our government is acting, you don't feel very believed. And someone just reassuring you and reaffirming, I do believe you. Or even, I believe that's possible that that happened to you. I would be really content with that at this point. Small steps. I think I've given you enough homework, so I'll stop there.
I definitely agree with Jessica in the sense of believing, if someone comes to you and talks to you, and just supporting them, and maybe, read up on the resources that are available within your county, so that you can try and help the person. Like, hey, you know what? I read up, and there's this. There's this resource, there's this person you can talk to, reach out to this one, and maybe you can even call for them, Sometimes that's what it takes, is for someone else to kind of jumpstart and, kick you in the butt, to get action started. But, just be a support system, I think.
Offer to watch their kids so they can go to therapy. It is very hard to be a single parent and get the tools that you need to take care of yourself and your children when you need someone to watch your children to do that, or even especially if you have to pay somebody to watch your children to do that, when typically there's financial abuse that's gone on and we have limited resources. So if you can do the practical things, watching kids, sending food, giving them cash so they can get gas, that takes us really far.
Okay, excellent. Next question.
Hi, Erin Smith at Family Violence Appellate Project. Thanks, Colsaria. I am horrified by the fact that Jessica's kids are in the partial custody of your abuser, and that you are still seeing him on a regular basis for custody exchanges. And people don't know that this is happening. I can't speak as much to the criminal legal system here because we work on the civil side, but the civil legal system is failing survivors. In 54% of cases of documented domestic violence, the abuser is granted custody. That is not okay. Our legal system is failing. So my organization appeals these cases. What can all of you do? Hold the local county judges accountable. I don't know if any members of our honorable judiciary are here. I'd love to speak with you later. I may have trained some of you in the past. We try to come around and train judges. It's really an uphill battle. They don't want to be trained by people who aren't judges. There is a presiding judge of San Mateo County who has the power to require the other judges of San Mateo County to attend training on domestic violence. We as a community can insist that that presiding judge make that training mandatory. When outcomes like Jessica's happen, we as a community need to say, that is not okay. So
I'm going to write a letter to the presiding judge tomorrow and request that he do that.
Thank you.
Susan Edizotti until the end of the year.
What's his name?
Right now it's Susan Edizotti, but in the beginning of the year it'll be John Karish. It changes every couple of years.
So they all need,
Yeah. There's not really a hierarchy. It's more shared over time. But yeah, those are the two, presently and in the beginning of the year. E-T-E-Z-A-D-I, and her first name is Susan. I hope that's the last test tonight, because that was hard.
So my question is about prevention more than it is about all the amazing services that you guys are doing every day in the trenches. And I'm wondering what the responsibility is of schools to get involved and almost mandate some sort of training for kids around what sexual harassment looks like, and as young as is appropriate based on educators that know a lot more than me. But I mean, we keep talking about the cycle, and it seems like the cycle won't be broken up here. It's going to be broken way down here. And I'm wondering if the public schools and private schools have any kind of incentive or motivation to have programs in place to address this. You see football players on TV getting off all the time, and these heroes of kids, for lots of different domestic violences that, like, every day their heroes are being, getting out of court. And I'm just wondering if that isn't an approach that, as taxpayers, that we could sort of put some pressure on our schools. And I think CORA does have programs where they go into schools, as I recall. But I mean, more on as a curriculum, more as a curriculum. If it's an epidemic, that's where we have to go with an epidemic, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. Go ahead, Jessica.
That's actually what I was doing in the meeting before I came to this one. So social emotional learning is now, I think, a state requirement, and part of that is teaching things like boundaries. So I know for the Milway School District, because that's the one that I am the director of this program, is parent education on how to teach consent starting in kindergarten. When we talk about boundaries and consent with little kids, it's obviously not sexual, but you can reduce sexual assault by quite a lot from what I've read by educating kids starting very young. So Millbrae has one now through the school district, and so if your local school district does not have a social emotional learning committee yet, ask for one. But it is now like a component of the curriculum that has to come out in California, so they should be rolling it out. What we need you guys to do, though, is then to volunteer to do the teaching for the parents, so that it's great that they're going to be handling this stuff in the classroom, but if the parents don't understand the material at home, then it's not going to go great.
I would add just one point to that as well. That is extremely important, that for the parents to really take an active role in that prevention piece. And I can tell you, as the father of a young daughter, that doesn't want my daughter to ever be in any type of these situations. You have to start young, and you have to talk about what's an acceptable touch, what's not an acceptable touch. All of those difficult conversations, the younger you have them with the child, the easier it is to have those conversations. So, and that's just from my own personal experience.
Rape Trauma Services has full-time educators who work in the schools every single day. The challenges that we come across are the minutes for academic time. We are CORA and I are in competition to see which teachers will have us in their classrooms, because they cannot give up enough time for them to have both domestic violence and sexual assault information. So we are consistently collaborating. We are consistently doing each other's work because we are not in the same places across the county. So social emotional learning is super important, and so is consent. Understanding that a lot of that only about 40% of grown-ups know what consent looks like. Also, we need our teachers, our superintendents, our district personnel to understand how to respond when they get a disclosure. The average child talks to 8 to 10 adults before first responders are called. And what we know is that changes a disclosure. Children do not feel believed, and so they recant. And that makes their job harder, it makes our job harder. This is a multi-layered, complex web that we have to get into, but we are working together to make it happen. I will also say that we need prevention funding. Everyone wants, 20 years ago when the Congresswoman was a board member of the YWCA of the Mid-Peninsula, that's right, me too, and I was a prevention educator there 20 years ago. Everything was about prevention, everything. Now, you can't fund a prevention. You have to do that through unrestricted funds, and no one wants to pay for it, and certainly nobody wants to pay to keep the lights on while you're doing it. So it is a struggle, and you're right, prevention has to start early. Often, they should be so sick of hearing from our two organizations by the time they get to high school that they're like my son, who's like, okay, mom, fine, yes, consent, get it, right? Instead, they're like, what? I don't understand. No one ever taught me that. I didn't know that you had to ask. I didn't know that you had to ask for a kiss and everything else. They don't know that they're assaulting each other because we're not teaching them that it's wrong.
Yeah.
I'd just like to offer a bit of a caution about the term consent, because the legal system sees it as consistent with acquiescence to power. Mm-hmm. It sees it as consistent with any time you say yes, no matter whether you really wanted something or not, particularly in the criminal justice system. I mean, California has some positive dimensions in its law on this and some somewhat less positive, but I would just be real careful with that term, because It is essentially, it's not an equal concept, even when it works. It's somebody pushing something on someone and that other person deciding whether they can afford or not, or to accept it, or it's sex stereotyped to the ground. It's about action, active and passive. Somebody acts on you and then you passively do or don't do something. And it's the reason that sexual harassment law, which is actually an equality law, has a completely different standard. It doesn't use consent. It uses welcomeness. Wanted, unwanted, but welcomeness. You know, sometimes, like lost fights in parked cars, then I just let him do what he wanted to do. All of that's consent by law. And, you know, so just be careful when you use their words, because a lot of times they don't mean what you want them to mean.
I'd like to just add something to that. I've worked on the issue of sexual assault in the military now for about 8 years. There's some 20,000 service members, mostly men, who are sexually assaulted every year in the military. One of the most scandalous cases was at Lackland Air Force Base, where when it was all finally said and done, 36 military training instructors had sexually assaulted 64 trainees. Not one of the trainees came forward because they were afraid. They wanted to get out of training so they could go on in their careers. They were afraid that they would be repercussions to doing so. And as I said to one of the military training instructors, the victims had said to me, there is no question mark at the end of the sentence when your instructor tells you to meet him in the storage closet.
Right.
Now, a similar situation is going on right now, and I just introduced a bill. There is a heightened incidence of police officers having sex with victims or accused, and the argument is they consented. Again, it's the disparity in terms of power is such that you can't.
They're armed.
So from my perspective, there should be a strict liability, and that's what we've done with military training instructors. And this particular bill that's been introduced would basically create a situation where there's no such thing as consent when you've picked up an accused or picked up a victim and are taking them to either jail or to a safe house.
If I could just add one thing. So as a parent, I would absolutely want to have my kids go through and understand good touch, bad touch, but I want to be cautious because, again, that leads us down the road of potential victim blaming, right? So the onus is on them to tell us when something's happened rather than us focusing prevention efforts on making sure that folks don't actually assault people in the first place. So I just want to be mindful of make sure that we are mindful of that when we're talking about this issue and we're talking about prevention.
I would really like to underline that point and say that it's one thing to focus on what we're doing with little children. I actually think that it is extremely educational to hold powerful people accountable for abusing someone. You abuse your power, you lose it.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I mean, just in terms of campus assault and what Betsy DeVos is doing to Title IX, I'm very concerned, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about HALT and what you're doing there. HALT, it's a program.
HALT is a bill that I've introduced now for 2 Congresses that creates greater accountability, greater transparency, and more support for the victims and more knowledge of what services are available and what their rights are. So the bill's been introduced. It's not been heard in committee because under the congressional system, it goes to a committee and the chairman has complete and utter authority over whether it will ever be heard, and virtually the only bills that are ever heard are those within the party in which the chair is a member of. So Betsy DeVos is trying to turn back the clock at a time when we had made such incredible advances in terms of holding universities accountable for doing proper investigations, for providing prevention services, for doing the training on the front end. And now she is trying to put all of the emphasis on protecting the perpetrator, which is pretty preposterous. But it's important to point out that this is a really misogynistic administration on every level. And it permeates everything. The Attorney General's action to basically violate the law that was a treaty that was passed by the U.S. Senate that was creating a means by which persons could seek asylum for domestic violence has been basically thrown out the window by just his edict. So the HALT Act exists. We worked very closely with the Office of Civil Rights under the previous administration. We had 4 of the top 10 universities in the country that were being investigated, and we made all of that public because every parent has the right to know whether or not there are proper safeguards put in place at a college or university for their child when they go to school there. It's the number one question that's asked at every orientation that I took my daughter to. So we've just got to get rid of Betsy DeVos for starters.
Congresswoman Speier, Joe Goethals, thank you so much for bringing us together for this conversation, and I apologize for being late. I was at the Burlingame City Hall where we had a different conversation happening this evening. But I did want to talk about the early response program and give kudos to CORA for the early response program and give them an opportunity to sort of highlight how we're unique in the city of San Mateo. Thank you.
You already have.
She already has.
So I've talked about it before, but we've responded. So we do have programs specifically to focused on law enforcement response and focused to make sure that we are working in conjunction with our law enforcement partners in order to make sure that survivors, no matter where they are able to access services and access emergency services, and provide that support so that law enforcement can do their jobs, right, and that we can also be the advocacy on the other end. And so we are able to do that 24 hours a day through our hotline program at CORA.
Other questions? Yes.
I've had the misfortune of learning a lot about this process in the last 2 weeks because of family experience.
I'm sorry, could you use the microphone?
I said I've had the misfortune of learning a lot about this process in the last 2 weeks because a family member had an experience. And I'm wondering about the effectiveness of restraining orders and how frequently those are violated, because once the perpetrator is out of jail and bail, the victim is terrified until this trial or whatever happens.
So restraining orders are effective. They're not magic, they're not 100%, but we do encourage people. And our position in the beginning of a criminal prosecution is to get a restraining order, even if the victim doesn't want it. There needs to be a period of time where there's cooling down, where it can be assessed what we're dealing with. If there's a plea, the defendant is going to end up going to counseling. And if the victim wants the restraining order limited to just no harass, so there can be contact, but some limitations on things they can't do, then they can be heard by the judge. But early on, we think that it's very important. And one of the things we did differently in the 90s when we first started this domestic violence unit was to be aggressive about telling the batterer, this is between you and us right now, not between you and the victim, because we know you can intimidate the victim, but you're not going to intimidate us. And if that message gets across, it's effective. Now, in the case I talked about with Maggie, nothing would have deterred him. And so the only thing they let Maggie sleep at night was when he got sentenced to prison for life. And, you know, you can't do that with everybody, obviously, and you can't predict lethality, but that's the way I think restraining orders are viewed.
And along those lines, for that law enforcement response, for every domestic violence incident, we always seek an emergency restraining order right there on the spot. There are times that the victims are reluctant to do that, so oftentimes we'll just kind of take the bull by the horns and say, hey, listen, we're going to make this call for you. We're going to call a judge. We're going to get you some protection. Because oftentimes, if given the opportunity, they may start to go, well, geez, I don't want to do this to them. Or so it's a matter of practice for us here in this county. And again, it isn't the magic bullet, right? I mean, what it does for us in law enforcement is if now that person violates that restraining order and goes near that person, the victim, we now have something enforceable where we can place an arrest on it. And oftentimes that may stack up the charges. It allows the district attorney's office a better likelihood of prosecution down the road. But again, if someone's absolutely intent, you know, we'll look at other options even outside of restraining order, relocation. Oftentimes, if it's serious enough, we're reaching out to CORA and some of our other supporters to say, can you provide some housing? There is housing where we can put people that's secretive, basically get a safe place for them and their children. And in the serious cases, we're always seeking that.
If I could please respond to the restraining order piece really quick. There's two types of restraining orders, right? So they're talking about the criminal side, and there's also the civil side, right? And there is a difference. It's a big difference between them. And there are things that are available to survivors through the civil side that aren't available through the criminal side. So often, even if there is a criminal protective order in place, we usually talk with survivors about the benefits of going for a civil restraining order, because there are so many other benefits you can ask for in the civil court system that you can't necessarily get through that criminal protective order because that's issued by the judge, right? In the criminal case. The other piece I want to say is where we will respectfully disagree is that we at CORA, as domestic violence advocates, we're never going to say that you need a restraining order. What we're going to say is, let's talk about all your options, and is it safe for you to get a restraining order? Because the truth of the matter is that survivors know they're the best resource to what's going to happen when that perpetrator gets the copy of, and gets notification around the restraining order, and that needs to be known. The survivors know if that perpetrator is going to come back to their mom's house and kill them. The survivors know if their dog is now in jeopardy. The survivors know whether or not they will show up at their school, and they are the best resource to tell us what needs to happen next.
Okay, Rosa?
Wanted to say, with the restraining orders, it's really important that the survivor knows to report any violation within that restraining order, as small as, you know, they think it might be, whatever kind of contact is made. That is enough to get a police report and just build the case even more. So any violation, report it. Make sure that it's known, and you know, hopefully the perpetrator gets arrested because of the violation.
And we're not trying to dictate to survivors. The important thing is there's a cooling off period that we feel needs to be enforced if there's been violence, and to let the perpetrator know that he'll be accountable, that we're not going to let his abuse of the survivor dictate the outcome. When it's settled down, especially if there's been an admission of guilt and an acknowledgement, they're moving forward, they want to reunite, we're not going to stand in the way of that. That's not our role. That's not our purpose. We want the violence to stop. We don't want to see the children in those settings being exposed to that, to violence and to threats and to control like that. And so that's why we have that approach initially.
Exactly right. It's just, it's to allow that cooling off period.
Well, and we actually see more collaboration. We see survivors access restraining orders when they've also accessed other resources. So sometimes they need to talk to an advocate first, and then the next time they're better prepared to go through with the restraining order process because they've also got other resources and information about what may happen and what's possible. And so it really is that collaboration piece, but I just needed to say that I definitely think that for our side of things and the domestic violence advocates, we really want people to think through the safety piece and make sure that they understand. And that is why that collaboration is so important, so that we can also help with that.
And remember, what we do at that time is called an emergency protective order. That's only good for a few days. That's all it's good for. It allows them that opportunity to speak to advocates and to talk to other people to decide if they want to continue further with another restraining order. But we really want to use every opportunity to protect the victim and their family on that initial onset. All
right, question in the back there.
Recently, I heard on the radio a segment by Terry Gross with Lori Handrahan about the epidemic of child rape, the trade in America. And these children, they're not survivors, they're in it, and they're voiceless. And my question is, what services, are for them, or what are we doing in society to try and help these children to get to be a survivor? It's a horrifying thought, and many of them don't. They wind up being sold, and they make videos of them, and then they sell their organs. Eventually, it's a horrific book this woman wrote about, and it exists everywhere. And sometimes I'll look at something and I'm like, that doesn't look right. You know what I mean? And I feel helpless, and I just would like to know if there's anything I can do, and if there's any services that are out there that address this.
So San Mateo County, once again, is at the forefront, and Chief Mannheimer might even want to come up and say a few words, but we've created a zero tolerance for sex trafficking in San Mateo County. So all of law enforcement has been trained, all the hotel clerks have been trained. I don't know, no, we haven't done taxi drivers yet, but we also have done the airport personnel and the flight attendants. So,
yeah, we've even, Congresswoman, like you said, we've trained the hotels. I know right here in our jurisdiction, we've done that. And specifically to what to look for in the case of trafficking of minors. This is an issue. We're aware of this issue. It's out there. Even during when the Super Bowl was here in town, one of the things that we learned in that process as we were preparing is that the instances of human trafficking during those times skyrocket. When people, so we were very much prepared for that. And I know the chief has a few points that she can speak to that.
I was just going to say, I absolutely feel your pain on this one, because there's nothing worse than especially the most powerless amongst us, the children. There are some really great law enforcement organizations and also victims advocates organizations, Internet Crimes Against Children, the ICAC, which is the FBI, but now is really partnering with local law enforcement. They are the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the NCMEC, and I could go into about 3 or 4 other acronyms, but they are all here now in the Bay Area. They've got centers all along the country. Actually, Congresswoman Speier brought an amazing program, Spotlight, to our county that had been used elsewhere in California. And that is one where it sweeps for just biometric or other features through all of the different online exploitation venues. And we proactively and religiously as law enforcement go over those, trying with all our might to identify any victims. So they are not just out there helpless. We are seeking out and searching those victims. And in San Mateo County, we have a tremendous protocol and a huge continuum that most of the folks up there in the front are involved in. So I just want you to know we are on the forefront, and that there are a lot of folks out there looking to rescue these young victims.
Yeah, I would say that, so if you see something that isn't right, call 911. That's what law enforcement is there for. There's also a national human trafficking hotline that's through the Polaris Project, and you can also call that number, and it rings to our human trafficking coordinator's cell phone. So call him. His name is John Vanek. He's a nationally known author of the Modern Abolitionist. We have a human trafficking initiative in this county. It meets the second Tuesday of the month at 12:30 at the Belmont Sports Complex. If you'd like to come, we need your help.
And we have our San Mateo County Police Chiefs and Sheriffs Association. I have Captain Gamez here from Daly City with me, and we are every month going out there with DA, with rape, with RTS, with all of the different victims serving, and we are going out seeking human trafficking victims to intervene in them. I did want to say one other thing, because I know you all were talking about what can you do. We're haunted at the San Mateo Police Department by a case in which we had 2 children in our PAL program, and we knew there were troubles at home. We couldn't figure out what they were, and they ended up getting murdered horribly by their father. And what's haunted me ever since and made us change our whole protocol in Police Activities League was to ask some simple questions. Are you okay? Is everything okay at home? How are you feeling? I noticed you're troubled. And I would say for each and every one of you here, do that with your friends. Do that with your family. Do that with acquaintances at work. We are our brothers and sisters keepers. And even just asking those questions, you never know if you're going to be that one that someone can turn to at that very moment. Because very often, almost like drug addiction, people come in out of the cold when they're ready. So be the one to ask the question when you see someone and really, really look for and wait to hear the answer. We can make a difference even just doing that.
If you see something, say something. You know, many of these sex trafficking activities are not going on in hotels anymore. They're going on in Airbnbs, where all of a sudden in your neighborhood you're going to see people coming all hours of the day and night. You should not be afraid to call local police or text 911. We now can text on 911 to send the thought to the police. They'll take it from there.
Yeah, that can't be stressed enough. I mean, we don't know unless we're notified, and we do follow up on any of those cases, and we'll go out there, we'll investigate it, we'll find out what's going on, and in fact, that's how these cases are discovered, because someone notices something that doesn't seem right, and they report it to us.
Okay, we're going to have to bring this wonderful conversation to an end. Thank you so much for participating, for your active questions, to our great survivors, to Rosa, Jessica, to Professor MacKinnon, to Colsaria, and to Amanda, and to Al, and to Ryan. Thank you all.